Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. My name is Alex Wolfers, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this launch event to mark the publication of two important new books, both published this year, on the mother, Mirra Alfassa. We have Patrick Beldio's book entitled The Mother of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram, co-creator of the Integral Yoga, and Peter Heehs' book, The Mother, A Life of Sri Aurobindo's Spiritual Collaborator. And our thanks to the University of Scranton Slattery Centre, as well as Georgetown University's Berkeley Centre for Religion, Peace and World Affairs for hosting today's event. So, who was Mirra Alfassa, and why is she the subject of these two books? Alfassa is widely known today as the spiritual collaborator of Sri Aurobindo, the Indian revolutionary turned mystic of Pondicherry. In the early 20th century, Aurobindo entrusted her with the material and spiritual responsibilities for his ashram community. However, although her image remains iconic, she's been largely neglected within the academic sphere. Perhaps she's been too often regarded as a little too strange, a little too inward-looking, and standing somewhat apart from history. This is quite unlike Aurobindo, who has received and continues to receive a great deal of scholarly attention. Her contributions in the main belong not to philosophy proper, in the ivory tower sense, but to theology and practical spiritual experimentation, aspects of her personality that are deeply entwined with her gender. She was, after all, fundamentally a collaborator, not a lone great man genius, which is, in fact, how often Aurobindo has been presented. But her story is one of spiritual encounter, anti-racist cosmopolitanism, and shared dreams under colonial conditions. Her relationship with Aurobindo was one which confounded expectations and transgressed both the philosophical categories and material hierarchies imposed upon them. She also outlived Aurobindo by over 2 decades, during which time she envisioned and established Auroville, the universal city of dawn, where people from all over the world would live together in harmony beyond the tribal bonds of nation and religion. Both of these books are therefore filling a real gap in current scholarship, rectifying her long-standing marginalization within the field of religious studies in general, and in that of Aurobindo studies in particular. It's also very auspicious timing that both books were published earlier this year, since next year the Sri Aurobindo Ashram celebrates the first centenary since its founding in 1926. Now, to introduce you briefly to our authors, both of whom I have learnt a great deal in my own work on Sri Aurobindo. Peter Heehs is an independent scholar based in Pondicherry, India. He's connected with the Sri Aurobindo Ashram archives and is on the editorial board of the Collected Works of Sri Aurobindo project. Heehs has published more than 70 articles in journals such as History and Theory, Modern Asian Studies, and Postcolonial Studies, and in magazines such as History Today and Art India. He is the author and editor of 13 books, the most recent of which are The Lives of Sri Aurobindo, Writing the Self, Diaries, Memoirs, and the History of the Self, which was named an outstanding academic title for 2013 by Choice magazine, and Spirituality Without God, A Global History of Thought and Practice. Patrick Beldio is a scholar and teacher of comparative theology, with specializations in Hinduism, Sufism, and Christian spirituality. He teaches in the Theology and Religious Studies Department at the University of Scranton, serves as a research fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Centre for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and is a core team member of Philosophy in the Arts, Arts in Philosophy, a cross-cultural research initiative on the role of the heart in artistic research and performance philosophy. He is also a professional sculptor whose work explores themes of rebirth and evolution. Now, together these books on Mirra Alfassa form a complementary pairing. Peter's grounded historical approach to biography, contrasting well with Patrick's expansive theological method. Before we hear from our authors, I just wanted to give a quick summary of both books. Peter's book divides Alfassa's life into two parts. Her first 5 decades before she established the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in 1926, and her last 5 decades, the latter half of which she led the growing community of believers and practitioners on her own. Peter starts with her Ottoman Jewish grandfather and his ties to the great Camondo banking dynasty, the Rothschilds of the East, as they migrated to Paris. He then follows her through her childhood and her privileged upbringing, her marriage, her early mystical experiences, and her artistic immersion in Parisian cultural life. He explores her deep engagement with the occult practitioners Max Theon and his spiritual consort Madame Theon, her experiences with mediumship, and the breakdown of her marriage in 1908. Soon after, she would remarry the spiritual politician Paul Richard, and the two would journey to India, where they met Aurobindo, just before the outbreak of the First World War. A chapter titled Exile covers the years of Alfassa's separation from Aurobindo, while she and Richard lived in Japan. Her joyful reunion with Aurobindo in 1920 saw her separation from Richard and the beginning of her maternal and disciplinary role within Aurobindo's somewhat anarchic community of practitioners. Peter then explores how she assumed more of a guiding authority, while Aurobindo moved further into the background. The second half of the book then charts Aurobindo and Alfassa's struggles to consolidate the ashram in the face of malicious rumours and various crises of health. Alfassa played a critical role here in formulating a new set of collective ceremonials and a novel grammar of guruhood. From 1934, the ashram community grew over the next decade from 150 residents to around 350. The presence of children required a new approach to organizing social life and pedagogy. Peter recounts in detail Alfassa's all-encompassing motherhood in action as World War II raged outside. India gained national independence, and Aurobindo died in 1950. Now in her early 70s, the book describes her navigation of decolonization processes and her relationship with politicians, including Nehru, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, and Indira Gandhi. In this political context, Peter has carefully explored her writings on the dream of a new universalism and global citizenship beyond borders, as well as her writing on death and the various ways to conquer it, the attainment of an integral immortality. Finally, the book details how she presided over the founding of Auroville along with 5,000 people, representing 124 countries, a place of unending education, of constant progress, and a youth that never ages. Peter's is a rich and flowing narrative which fills many of the gaps in our present understanding of both Alfassa and life in the ashram under her care. Patrick's book is more theoretical in its approach, though it similarly structures its analysis in two parts. Part 1 establishes the biographical and intellectual foundations of Alfassa and Aurobindo's independent mystical practice, before showing how their orientations complement one another as spiritual consorts. Part 2 focuses on some important differences between their understandings, and particularly on how Alfassa developed the integral yoga after Aurobindo's death. Patrick argues that their shared labouring to bring down the supermind and usher in a new transfigured species of post-humanity required a division of labour, a differentiated allocation of responsibilities that took place as much in seclusion and silence as in activity and practical selfless service. Patrick bases much of his argument on Aurobindo's 1928 text, The Mother, which outlines 4 central attributes or personalities of the Mahashakti, of universal motherhood: Maheshvari, or wisdom; Mahakali, or strength; Mahalakshmi, or harmony; and Mahasaraswati, or perfection. His final 4 chapters unpack each of these in turn. Maheshvari becomes an opportunity to explore the role of mind in the integral yoga, the tensions that arise in the yogic struggle to annihilate the mind and transform the intellectual sheath, or the possibility of replacing it with a higher sheath of consciousness in the rebirth of a new supramental species. The strength of Mahakali focuses on Alfassa's understanding of theodicy. How can the forces behind all forms of opposition in life, including death, evil, and suffering, be used to fuel advancement within the psychic being? How might opposition and contraries provide a stimulus to progress? The harmony of Mahalakshmi demonstrates how Alfassa's conception of a future art builds on Aurobindo's aesthetic theory. How does creative self-expression and divine beauty fit into the evolutionary journey? And finally, a chapter on the perfection of Mahasarasvati tackles the differences between Alfassa and Aurobindo's descendant path of world-affirming spiritual practice and some of the alternative ascendant approaches outlined by their contemporaries. Here, Patrick explores the path of world perfection in relation to an ethic of helplessness and hopelessness. Patrick has given us the first comprehensive philosophical study of Mirra Alfassa and her role in formalizing Aurobindo's integral yoga, as well as re-establishing her significance as a spiritual teacher in her own right. I'm now going to facilitate a conversation between our authors for the next hour or so to explore their studies in more depth. There will be time for some audience questions at the end, so please do think about what you might want to ask Peter and Patrick as we go along. To begin with, I wonder if we could start on the question of influence. And Patrick, could you start us off? To what extent can we regard Alfassa as an independent thinker, and what were her main contributions to the integral yoga?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And what a lovely introduction both to Peter's book and mine and to our backgrounds and so forth. I'm honored to be here. I think this is such an important conversation to be had. Um, because, yeah, I think, my book argues that Mirra must be regarded as an independent thinker, and recognizing this is truly essential for accurately understanding the integral yoga itself and Sri Aurobindo as well. Um, as Alex, your own writing, I mean, I was really influenced by your article, I guess, in 2017, where you kind of gave a really lovely bibliography of all of the secondary literature that at that time outlined the scholarly, understanding, but that it revealed such a huge scholarly bias. It's very extreme that at least by my numbering or counting, 2.4% of all secondary literature on the integral yoga focuses on Mirra versus Aurobindo, and that academic scholars either ignore her entirely or diminish her as a quote, a controlling autocrat or a born organizer. And my book argues three essential claims that Mirra is essential for understanding the integral yoga. Leaving her aside gravely misunderstands what Aurobindo taught, and her contributions both fulfill and change his vision. Even before Mirra ever met Aurobindo, she had her own independent spiritual formation, and in Europe. From about age 5, she was engaged in meditation, and around age 13 to 14, she described spontaneously leaving her body at night to heal suffering Parisians under what she described as a magnificent golden robe. She worked with the Theans, this older couple we'll no doubt talk about, this European couple who were kind of interested in the occult and so forth. She met them and worked with them in the early 1900s, made discoveries with them that they had never made, in fact. She described discovering this, quote, the principle of the human form and this domain of love, which she later identified as the supermind, what Sri Aurobindo called the supermind. And when she arrived in India in 1920, the second arrival, she told Aurobindo, I have already had the experience of supermind. It was a work accomplished and a well-known domain. So again, this is a picture of a woman who had her own life and agency and so forth and her own experience that she was bringing to the table. And I guess I see five major contributions that she makes. And in different ways, I talk about this in the book. The first, that the strategy of working from below, not above, that is descending into the consciousness of the vital and the physical, the unconscious, the subconscious, the inconscient, rather than trying to transform the mind directly. Second, she makes the psychic being operationally central, discovering in 1970, much later in her life, that, and I'm quoting her, the psychic being is the one that will materialize and become the supramental being. And then third, she restructures the yogic methodology around surrender to the Divine Mother, um, to her, it sort of begins with herself, that focus. And that's actually, of course, begun with Sri Aurobindo restructuring that method, and she's, supporting that. Fourth, she's creating a collective yoga through the ashram community, 80 departments or so, even now. There's a school that she initiates in World War II. She reimagines what an ashram could be. And fifth, and most significantly, theologically, she insists that the mind, the intellect, the rational being must be destroyed, not transformed. And this becomes, I think, the most interesting theological and philosophical difference between she and Aurobindo. It's the most crucial, I think, because Aurobindo taught most of his life, if not all of it, that the mind could be transformed and brought forward into this new age of the supermind. Mirra consistently taught that mind and vital sheaths are temporary instruments that must be destroyed and replaced, as I read it. And possibly, though, in Aurobindo's last essays that he wrote from 1949 to 1950, I don't know. I mean, there's some evidence of Aurobindo adopting her view, or at least speculating about it, but I think it's very tenuous. She didn't just implement Aurobindo's vision, though. I mean, she corrected it through her own experiences after he died, and she experienced transformation in her body, as she claimed. And as Aurobindo himself said around 1927, your body is better than mine. You can undergo the transformation better than I can do. So, I think I end there where I begin there in my book and end there, that it's Sri Aurobindo's own view that she's essential and an independent thinker herself.
And Peter?
Going strictly by the words of your question, I don't know that one can say that she was an independent thinker, because she didn't proceed by rationally moving around abstract ideas and coming up with new ideas through this process of ratiocination. That just wasn't her method. I agree with much of what Patrick says, but in effect, what he was saying is what I believe, that most of what she offered, what she brought to the integral yoga, was forms of practice. And there were forms that she herself developed, and she I think her real contribution was that of the maker of a great synthesis, of bringing in different ideas from the East and the West, and various traditions, the esoteric traditions that she got an opening to through the Tayons, the Indian tradition that actually Sri Aurobindo introduced her to, and various other things that she made just a big, powerful package that enormously strengthened the integral yoga. And also her attempt to reach out and communicate it and transmit it in a way that Sri Aurobindo, I think, without her, would never have felt the need to do. The very fact that Sri Aurobindo spent 6 years writing the aria and himself putting his ideas into intellectual form, I think one can say came through the pressure that she exerted when she met him in 1914. So the certainly there was a mutual influence there, and the I think the yoga as it took shape would not have been what it is without both of them interacting. So Patrick had a rather long and intricate sort of set of things that he's been thinking about and he put in his book. So I can't answer each of those points, but the idea I think he may have overemphasized the idea of destruction of the mind and vital. If you look at her works about education, the perfection of the mind had a very important place. The perfection of the vital had a very important place. The perfection of the body had a very important place. And I don't see the process of transformation that Patrick mentioned as necessitating destruction. That seems a bit overdone. Certainly, if we want to sum up, and I think I don't want to get into too much detail here. The what she brought, her main contribution was to execute in the ashram and in her own yoga what he had conceived, and then gave this practical opening to others. And that's what the ashram was all about. And the ashram, of course, wouldn't have been there without her. So I don't know that we want to set too much of an opposition between them and the way they approached. I'm sure Patrick and I could sort of debate about this or pick apart each other's argument, but I don't think we should spend too much time on any of your questions. So that's something that could be gone into in more depth later. But I have a sort of general agreement with what he said. But I think even between the mother and Sri Aurobindo, I think the whole approach was more synthetic. And so each had something to offer, and they together they made what has become the yoga.
Patrick, would you like to reply to that just briefly? Just on the
Yeah,
idea of whether she introduced certain philosophical, intellectual frameworks
right.
that
No,
would
I
not.
think strictly speaking, I think, yeah, Peter's correct. I mean, if you stay within the boundary of independent thinker and think of thinker and compare her writings to Sri Aurobindo's very organized, systematic, writings, of course, that's not the same. She does provide more practical advice about practice. But she's also describing a teaching, I think, that is independent thinking. So, I mean, I guess I think the issue of mano nasha, that's what I situate her experience, her spiritual practice, and her description of her spiritual practice in my book within a longer tradition or traditions of yoga in India that place the destruction of the mind as equal to or the process of mukti or moksha, that the mind is not transformed but annihilated. But that's of course debated even among these traditions, and I think Peter's right to push back on what I'm saying. It's very extreme. I suppose I don't know of anybody else who's arguing what I'm seeing. But I don't think she was saying this is what happens for everyone. I don't think of course, in her emphasis on education for children, the mind should be strengthened, not destroyed. It really is something that happened to her much later in her own life, and saw it as a potential to be experienced by the new species in the future. So yeah, I agree but I also agree with Peter too that we could dial into this, but we could also move on to other questions. But I think this is a central issue too, and so
Mm.
um, that's my first initial responses to that.
Well, I mean, so building on this point then,
Mm.
just if we could focus on the question of the Theons, Max and Madame Theon, her first spiritual teachers. Could you talk more about their intellectual influence and how that informed their integral yoga or the wider ashram ethos? And additionally, what, if any, was the influence of Paul Richard? Um, Again, in terms of philosophical ideas and frameworks, things that Aurobindo wouldn't have otherwise been working within as a metaphysical framework, as a point of perception.
Right. I don't know if, I mean, I relied a lot on Peter's work on this, as well as another scholar, Buzz Heehs, I forget his name, Peter, the Israeli scholar.
Boas Hus.
Yes, Boas Hus, thank you. Um, there were many kind of, I guess, well, I wonder if, Peter, would you mind situating us in that? I think your historical kind of descriptions are so good with that.
Yeah, and there again, I don't think there was all that much intellect involved. Theon certainly was not an intellectual. His wife, Mary Ware, was even less so. She was she was quite a number of things, but her ideas came out in somewhat disorganized fictions and speculations, and almost like fantasy novels. If you read them, it's hard to find any intellectual substance. Um, Tan was a little better because he'd studied, if not Kabbalah, at least some forms of Jewish mysticism and thought, and so there's some organized ideas there. But from the two of them, the mother didn't get ideas so much as forms of practice that she made very good use of. Um, Passing on quickly to Paul Richard, you mentioned here he was an intellectual, um, not an original one. He might have given the mother some philosophical ideas. She already, before she met him, had sort of trained herself as a thinker in certain forms. Something that there was um, this mental development, that was very popular at the time, um, that she entered into and conveyed to a small group of people that gathered around her in Paris. So her mind was prepared by the time she met first Theon and Richard. But I think from Richard, I don't know really what one can say that she got from him. They were together for 13 years. He kind of determined the course of her life during that time, and she went along with him. But I don't think that he had much influence on her mind. Rather, it was the other way around. She, in the end, realized that all along she'd been trying uh, as she put it, convert him, and failed to do so. And he went off more or less untouched by what she had to give him. So there again, there was not so much intellectuality, Alex, I think, that was involved as a sort of scattering of ideas that she was able to uh, uh, fit into this synthesis that she was developing. And that then when she, in 1920, let's say, when she finally returned to Pondicherry and joined Sri Aurobindo, she had something to offer there that had intellectual content, obviously, but it wasn't arrived at through a sort of philosophical process of analysis and all of that sort of thing. More, she was a great synthesis, and that again is how I see her as what her contribution was.
Yeah, and I
So
guess
how do you, yeah.
yeah, well, I guess the key concepts that you wrote about and that I used a lot in my writing were these concepts she got from the Theons in the cosmic philosophy. The duality of being, the psychic being is probably the most central concept that she took forward. Um, the glorified body, the hostile forces. And for me, also probably a really important one is the domain of love, this experience of a plane of consciousness that she identified with supermind, that Sri Aurobindo, of course, innovates in his trajectory on Sri Ramakrishna and his notion of vijnana. So anyway, I think those are at least concepts, you're right, that she synthesizes into the integral yoga, and without them, I think Sri Aurobindo's, I mean, they're just key to what is brought forward and made into the mix.
I quite agree with that. And you put your finger on uh, the ideas that uh, were the primary ones she could offer to Sri Aurobindo when she came. But I don't think so. Again, it was an intellectual process. I think
Hmm.
she just sort of was presented with these ideas, and immediately she could seize hold of them without
Hmm.
having to go through a whole process of thinking about them.
Right.
I
Yeah,
mean,
she really talked about experiencing them. Yeah.
on the point in terms of these key concepts which you mentioned, Patrick, would you say they all come from the Theons? I mean, is there that distinctive trajectory um,
Hmm.
that leads to her introducing them to into Aurobindo's practice?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one can she herself described them as being found, like for instance, the glorified body was something one can find in, and this is Peter's research, really good on Lurianic Kabbalah, texts, the Zohar, and I talked about that, and of course the glorified body is central to mystical traditions of Christianity, and I'm starting to do study.
And Gnosticism.
Yeah, and Gnosticism especially. Yeah. And Sufism. I've been reading Ibn Arabi lately, and it's all over his work. It's just it's beautifully sort of integrated in his work. Um, so yeah, this is where the synthesizing instinct is coming for her. She's really not concerned with you could say, of pedigree and so forth. But she's just bringing in whatever is naming her experience, and she's just going to grab hold of it. But then you can go back into these, maybe sacred texts like the Bible, for instance. I teach the Bible at a Catholic school, and I'm finding myself, reading these texts with my students and seeing Mother's descriptions in them, even though she would have never, I think, thought that these were that one could interpret them that way. She wasn't a practicing Jewish person, of course. So, but I find them there, and I'm finding them in Ibn Arabi's work and so forth. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think she wasn't herself so concerned with these, yeah, these
Well, she
lineages.
wasn't concerned with them as ideas, but if she
Hmm.
could
Mm.
make use of the thought behind them and bring it into her own experience, inhabit it, then it became real for her. But
Hmm.
not through thinking out, and of course she didn't know the historical background of the idea of the psychic being and the
Right.
soul spark that's deeply entrenched in the esoteric traditions of the West.
Yeah, and then so Sri Aurobindo takes that up and he sort of identifies it with Vedantic thought, and I don't know how unusual that is. It's something, Peter takes up a little bit more, and Stephen Phillips' work,
Mm.
of course, does. Um, But I think the fact that she thinks the psychic being is going to become manifest as a body itself, that's really innovated. That's entirely her innovation. I don't see that in Sri Aurobindo's work, that this spark
And
is
it's not in the Tales ideas either.
right, right. That's
Right.
your own.
Yeah. Would you say there's, I mean, I'm sorry to stay on this question um, for such a long time, but would you say there's another distinctive source for these kinds of thoughts that are not coming in via the Theons? Or you think it is just her own experiences, her own maybe eternal sources?
I think so. I think it's her. I mean, she describes at least viewing, having visions of this body, and both in the domain of love or the supramental planes, she sees this body completely awoken, and then she also goes down and sees it in the dark kind of cave of the inconscient and sees it sleeping there. I think that's really for her anyway, kind of singularly formative for her speaking about it and describing it, and that's why for her it's a unique discovery that the Teons don't have that experience either. And she shares that with Sri Aurobindo when she finally arrives, and he says, "Oh, that must be the supramental body or supramental form." He himself doesn't sort of say, "Oh, I had that experience too." He just confirms for her what she thinks is about what that is. And then later she paints pictures of it with her students, and it becomes inspirational for artwork and certainly for my own artwork as well. So that's why I've kind of thought about it myself. But what do you think, Peter?
It's, as I said, it became real for her when she could experience it.
Yeah.
And when she did, then she could link it to things that she had learned from others and what Sri Aurobindo was saying. And so it was kind of an offering she had. And he admitted that he got that idea from the mother. Um, he, working with the Vedantic, broadly Vedantic framework, of course, tried to fit it in to the planes and parts of the being as seen in Vedanta, traditional
Mm.
Vedanta, and also his own particular new sort of Vedanta. I don't want to say neo-Vedanta because that's a kind of laden term, but so he tried to find a place for it. You'll notice in the early chapters, an early chapter of the Life Divine, he starts off with the sevenfold plane of being. And then he said, well, you can have eight planes too, and the eighth is the psychic being. So it doesn't quite fit into that traditional Puranic pattern. But yeah, he was a synthesizer too. So we
Right, you have
were
tantric
bringing
as
in
well.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Could I move us on now to specifically her ideas on integral immortality, which are often thought of as one of her big contributions to Aurobindo's yoga. I wonder if you could both tell us more about the relationship between her specific understanding of psychosomatic spiritual health and disease, and the workings of the so-called hostile forces, how those two things would relate. And to Peter in particular, I was intrigued by your retelling of Aurobindo's kind of sudden and very unexpected death in December 1950 due to a mild kidney infection, against the doctor's repeated recommendations that he begin antibiotics. Mirra had refused them on his behalf, and he consequently
And
died.
he also wouldn't have wanted it. It wasn't that he was uh, just going along with her. He they both didn't think so much of allopathic medicine, as it's called in India, normal Western medicine. Um, so yeah, it's why did he not fight against it? I mean, it was in a way even then. Um, prostatitis and uremia. I mean, they're treatable. and he just didn't want to go through it. But getting back to your broader question, I think of this what do you call it? It's a very nice phrase. Psychosomatic spiritual health. Well, that's very much her the approach that she in her works on education she stressed is having a balance between the mind, the life, and the body. And I didn't quite see your link between that and the hostile beings. Um, things like that. It's she knew what she was talking about when she said things like that. I don't think too many other people actually are in a position to usefully speak about that kind of thing. And when people do start talking about it, it causes, I think, a lot of confusion to them and to others. Um, right, I mean, she saw uh, disturbances in the body and the life force and the mind as they could be described as coming from forces from without, not just one's own human nature with its difficulties and so forth. That it was something that had to be um, fought against. But at least in her writings outside of the agenda, writings meant for publication and communicated to uh, the people in the ashram, the students in the ashram. She didn't really talk too terribly much about that sort of thing. And I'm glad about that because it when people get and Sri Aurobindo pointed out that when people gets kind of obsessed about that way of looking at things, they often lose balance. And for her, balance in that was the big thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I take this up in one of my chapters in terms of health and relating it to, I mean, her experience of her body's transformation, that the health of the body becomes a question. Um, I mean, as we've talked about already, the psychic being is this evolving soul that for her will eventually manifest as a physical body, and that this body would be capable eventually, as she described it, hosting immortal consciousness and force, and that the mother's agenda is all about the I mean, one could read it as that. I mean, that's how she interpreted that her cells themselves had to be transformed, divinized, but they would go through a really difficult, hostile sort of process. So reading the mother's agenda, I think, is important for this question. Um, what she describes different diseases there and so forth. But it is, I think, as Peter points out, really important to kind of not. I mean, she was concerned about the disbalance of her students and so forth, and of course, there's good evidence of people not taking heed of that. But in my own kind of chapter on this, I talked about disease, how she thought it signaled transformation attempting to happen. Not always, but it could be that, and that the body is trying to reorganize around supramental consciousness, but old patterns in the body resist it. And she writes this. She says this in 1971, kind of late in her process. It's as if the two extremes, a marvelous state and a general decomposition, were here like this, inextricably intertwined. But for her, disease isn't just malfunction, it's friction between old and new consciousness trying to occupy the same cells. One might think of renovating a new house or an old house while living in it. And from the outside in, it could look like a collapse. But if you understand the blueprint, you could see the transformation. That's kind of how I see it. Or maybe building a plane while you're flying it, maybe more so. Um, but this is where I think the hostile forces become, in my reading anyway, crucial for understanding what she's saying. These are forces of disequilibrium, as she said, that automatically oppose progress and growth, maybe like Newton's third law applied to consciousness. That Aurobindo, he connected these hostile forces to Vedic asuras. And I think Mirra's insight and this is key. She mentions this in her commentary on Sri Aurobindo's aphorisms. She says, opposition is the quickest and most effective means to bring creation out of its inertia and lead it towards fulfillment. I think in my reading, the hostile forces serve a few functions. They test one's readiness. So if the body can't handle pressure, it shouldn't attempt transformation yet. Second, resistance training is what they provide. Just it's like weight-bearing exercises, strengthen bones, muscle tissue. Opposition strengthens the body's capacity to hold supramental consciousness. Third, clearing out the old. Disease breaks down outmoded structures for rebuilding. And I think this is Mirra's transformation or death principle. You kind of bring up that the hostile forces create crisis. Either the body transforms to accommodate new consciousness or it breaks it down. In traditional yoga, I mean, one tries to avoid this by leaving the body. And in the integral yoga, one is, I think, aspiring at least to stay in the body even through processes of collapse and rebuild around supramental consciousness and the relationship. So between, I think, integral immortality, as you call it, and hostile forces is one of creative tension. Integral yoga is the goal. Or I'm sorry, integral immortality is the goal, and a body hosting this supramental consciousness without death. So the hostile forces are the means, I guess, in her view, creating pressure and even fueling this process. And apparent disease comes forward, and that forces transformation and breakdown to happen. But one doesn't seek it out, and I think
But do you think that certainly in the agenda, she visualized the process in those terms? But do you think much of that can apply to anybody but her?
anybody but her? No, no, I don't see that. I mean, I think she didn't see that anyway.
In general terms, yes. But as a process, as a way of visualizing a process, do you see it as something that an ordinary person, ordinary sadhak going through the events of a life and events of a sadhana really has to give all that much importance to, and
Uh-huh.
productively?
Yeah, I think she saw this as unique to herself, but that it would become a pandemic later. That's kind of what I argue in the book is that, yeah, this is a very unique process. Uh, and I mean, I'm calling it manonasha in my kind of larger frame, but I think manonasha doesn't happen very often to very many people at all. And, or the supramentalizing of the body doesn't happen to very many people at all. And that's what she thought, but that it was what was unusual. I guess past spiritual practice and spiritual treatises, when you read about liberation, mukti, and so forth, that is a very rare occurrence to happen to very rare beings. And that integral yoga, I think, is claiming that we're moving into an era now where these very rare experiences that would have happened to, say, Ramakrishna or Ramana Maharshi or her or Aurobindo, that they are going to be ordinary. And they're going to go from the extraordinary to the ordinary. But right now, we're not there for sure. And I guess, yeah, does one so, I mean, I think your concern is valid. Do you, I mean, is your concern that people will sort of seek these processes out and try to stimulate them externally, artificially? Um,
Problem is, people can look at perfectly ordinary problems of their
mhm,
own psychology in
mhm.
terms of hostile forces and physical processes, and seeing it in terms of transformation of the cells and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, that possibly doesn't apply to them where
Mm-hmm.
they are at that moment,
Mm-hmm.
and might very well lead them astray. And when people going back even to the 30s, 40s, when people started in their correspondence talking about hostile forces and that sort of thing, Sri Aurobindo generally said, "Whoa, that's not your problem. We'll worry about that."
Yes. I think there's a ton of confusion about mixing what I would call psychological growth versus spiritual unfolding growth, and or just, these inner processes which are very rare. And yeah, they apply to her, or, I like I say, I agree with you. I think that it's sort of makes sense for people not to start subjectively applying or describing their processes with these descriptions. Um, and so, I mean, she was the first to say, I mean, that's why she set up in the ashram. And you can tell me more about this, Peter, of the nursing, is it called? The hospital there, and the allopathic care, which also offers Ayurvedic care and homeopathic. She was interested in making sure that the kind of best practices in medicine were available to people, and it wasn't just, heal thyself kind of um, methodologies,
Well,
right?
I think they would say, both of them,
Uh-huh.
that your attitude and your practices when you're confronted with some sort of physical imbalance are more important than medicine, but um, they would never hesitate to send somebody to the doctor.
Hmm.
And so there was a well-equipped medical service. It still is.
Right.
Um, and the other options are also there. But I think that now even the tendency is to put more faith in ordinary uh, medical procedures. And so when people get sick, they go to the dispensary.
Hmm.
And what they'll get for the most part is Western medicine.
Yeah. So there needs to be, I think she was so practical. She was very like balancing, the very different personalities in this community in the ashram at different stages of growth, some of whom were very psychologically maybe imbalanced or needed more shoring up of a psychological sort of support. And other people who maybe were maybe more advanced spiritually, and she could work with them in different ways. And I think it was very case
Mhm.
by case. Um, but it does, that's, I think, the purpose of a guru, is that they've been down the road longer. And so you need someone to sort of say, no, you're talking about psychological issues. These are not spiritual issues, or vice versa. And don't trust your own sort of egotistical version, I don't know, judgments about these. And so why living in communities is important, why having a guru is important, at least in this context, in this intentional community context, is important. And it overlaps with my experience of Sufism. I mean, I belong to a Sufi community where we have a teacher, and these very same issues come up, of Sufis who going through processes, and we all sort of want to instantly say, "Oh, this is a spiritual process I'm going through," and you know, when yeah, just I don't know, get some rest, take a pill, go to the doctor.
Let's
Um,
get back to Alex and another question.
Well,
sure.
I'm wondering if we could now turn to more the nature of their relationship and the centrality of gender, themes around gender. Since already by the time Alfassa met Aurobindo in 1914, India had hosted a whole series of white women drawn to Hindu spirituality and willing to submit to the religious authority, the spiritual authority of Indian men, in the process assuming a certain transgressive countercultural platform. These are women prepared to live against the grain of their own cultures and elevate India's material interests, not just spiritual, but material interests, over and against their own national interests in the name of a universal humanity. So I've been writing about this kind of type recently as calling them spirit mothers. And we've got people from, Margaret Noble is a key one, Sister Nivedita, Vivekananda's disciple. Many of them, in fact, have this kind of marginality in relation to British imperialism. So Nivedita was Irish, or had some kind of Irish background, Irish roots, Scots-Irish. Theosophist Annie Besant, also Irish, French woman who you've written about, Peter, Alexandra David Neal, friend of Mirra Alfassa. And also there's Vivekananda's main patron in America, his so-called American mother, Sarah Chapman Bull, who has links to Norway, which was at the time struggling under Swedish domination. So I'm just wondering if you could both tell us about this gender dynamic, the centrality of gender to their collaboration, and that kind of power dynamic, what that analysis might add.
Well, as Patrick had mentioned earlier, the mother viewed this in terms that she learned from the Cosmic group of dualité d'être, this complementary male-female thing. There was a duality. The English word is slightly different, and that as the cosmic people viewed it, one had to search for one's dualité, one's partner. And I think she brought that into her approach to Sri Aurobindo. He, of course, had the Indian philosophical and religious idea of Ishwara and Shakti to draw upon. You were thinking in more, I think, political terms, and one could go into that, but it might take us a little far. Certainly,
I'd say historical rather than political, but the personality is politics side of things rather than politics in the main, but just
right.
factoring in, race, gender, as well.
Well,
But historicizing it, seeing that there's a whole genealogy of these white women who are drawn to kind of countercultural power that along racial lines, racial and gendered lines.
yeah. I mean, many people have noted this. I guess you've done the research. I don't know if you've looked into Ram Guha's treatment of it, and very much in his book on Gandhi of featuring Madeline Slade, who
Yeah.
was the daughter of a British admiral. So there was a place for that. Even more broadly, I mean, quite a number of the people, what now would be called gurus in the general sense, were supported by Western women, many of them widowed, and just that's there's a number of instances of that. So how you theorize it, I hadn't really done so much in that way. I think that there was a kind of an inevitability of Sri Aurobindo and the mother coming together as they did, because they did represent different ways of looking at things, and when that came together, it formed a very powerful combine. Well, one thing that struck me as I was thinking about this the afternoon, that in the Western idea, it's usually the masculine element is usually seen as the active, and the feminine element is usually seen as passive, and that's very explicit in the cosmic, that you would have the sort of the visionary, and then the female would be the passive, the passive, and Theon certainly treated the mother in that way, as someone who had sort of mediumistic abilities. Oddly enough, in India, it's just the opposite. The dynamic side is the female, the Shakti. Shakti means power, and the Purusha especially in Sankhya philosophy, is totally passive. I've never quite been able to figure out how that sort of switch took place, but in each case there's a sort of active role and a passive or witnessing role, as in Sankhya. Um, and so in this way, I mean, Sri Aurobindo did fulfill the role of the Purusha, the witness, the one who stood back or stood above, Udasina. Whereas the mother was very much the Shakti. I mean, once, and this was a big transformation for her, that throughout her early life, she was kind of retiring, let other people sort of take the leading role. And then once she meets Sri Aurobindo, bang, after a few years of sort of uh, gathering in, then she was full dynamism and something that she'd really never been in her earlier life. So somehow the two came together and created a spark or whatever you like, and could express it. It could express itself, or they could express themselves in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm thoughtful too of their marriages, you know, how Shri Aurobindo, I mean, they both felt, I think, at home and not at home in their own respective places of birth, and identified and didn't identify with them and so forth. And so there was a sort of, like you say, an inevitability about when they met, they would sort of spark, because they were, I mean, and in the way that they did. I mean, Aurobindo was, you know, he got married and married a very traditionally educated, you know, Bengali woman, back from a Bandrlock, or, you know, higher class. I mean, it wasn't this um, educated person like himself, and cosmopolitan and so forth. And of course, Mirra Alfassa, she's divorced and married again, and seeking to convert her second husband, but he doesn't. And then she meets Aurobindo and realizes this is her partner, in and so forth. And so there's this recognition of their coming from different places, but wanting to achieve similar goals. And so that's where I start. I guess my book is theological, Peter's is historical. And so I'm kind of, you know, dealing with these things as categories like you are somewhat, Alex, in terms of, I like this, you know, spiritual mother category. I use the category of spiritual consorts in my book to talk about their relationship. And what I mean by that is simply equal partners coming together, sharing complementary scopes of work and working for a common mission. And and like you say, this very different east-west notion of passive and active is there. But I think that switches too, even in the case of Aurobindo and the mother, that at first the mother is very much passive. Before the 1926 official founding, you could say, of the ashram, she's kind of in the back, and Aurobindo's in the front, and then they switch, and then he's in seclusion and she's out front, and she's building the patterns of life in the ashram and so forth. But then when he passes away, she sort of does both. And she claims, anyway, she does both, that she's like both doing the sadhana and bringing down the supermind, which is what his work was, this kind of seclusion work to bring down the supermind. And then she was supposed to be administering the active ashram and channeling that energy into her students through her body and so forth. Um, when he passes away, then she needs to do both things, and that sort of becomes very onerous, and not sort of, it just is very hard on her body. And eventually you could see that weight of that, at least people interpret it, you know, when you look at her old pictures, I mean, later in life, she's very much kind of weighed down, and this force is sort of feeling like it's there. But she goes into seclusion even there. Like, she has what people think, what the doctors think, she has a heart attack, and she goes into seclusion for much of the final years of her life, right, Peter? And there's sort of less activity going on, but she's still maintaining connection to the department heads and making sure the ashram is running at a certain level. But that is a division of labor happening, I think, always either together or singularly of supermind, which has this simultaneity of both active and passive. And to do both at the same time is what the supermind, I think, is theorized about. What Sri Ramakrishna talked about, Vijnana, is this simultaneous experience of both Brahman, who's nirguna and saguna, with and without attributes, personal and impersonal, feminine, masculine, all the dualities that are there. So I kind of get into that in my book in terms of theological and philosophical ideas and how those are manifesting in the practical design of the ashram, in the life there.
Um, I'm just going to skip the next question on rumor and move just to drill down further onto the theme of femininity.
Sure.
Just asking you to think about the tensions now between the way in which she's performing her femininity, which surprised many within and outside the ashram, with her jewelry, makeup, and perfume, and the nature of the way in which she's embodying spiritual ideals. Because in a way, it's quite a foreign, exotic approach that she's taking. How were these negotiations? How are these tensions negotiated or interpreted? And also, I mean, specifically for you, Patrick, the tensions between how she's embodying a certain kind of femininity
Mm-hmm.
and her conceptions of gender and the notions of the androgynous new being,
Yeah.
the vision of transfigured post-humanity that you've talked
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, I see her as both a mother figure and a child figure. That's kind of how I frame her, that she at least claims that I mean, she's embodying this universal Mahashakti as well as a child, and this child with a capital C, which has roots. I mean, I trace it. I mean, I think her Jewish background is is there. I don't think she's, drawing from that at all. But this idea of this child that you see in the Old Testament as well as in the New. But anyway, I think in terms of femininity, and that's another topic. I mean, she's intensely feminine in her presentation. I mean, she's using cosmetics, she's silk clothing, elaborate attention to her beauty and material culture. She's interested in flowers. Um, and yet her spiritual vision, like you say, is post-human. I mean, it's post-gender. And this, I think, surprises and sometimes troubled her ashramites who expected a more traditional image of a guru of renunciation, simplicity, traditional, this traditional sadhu aesthetic. And instead, they got a guru who cared deeply about fashion, perfume, flowers, color coordination in buildings, even the design of sportswear, for the children in the ashram school. And I think the tension there is that, how does someone who embodies such an elaborate femininity teach that the future body will be insexué, unsexed, beyond gender? And I think Amir's answer is that you don't transcend gender by denying it or making it invisible. You transcend it by expressing it, mastering it, exhausting all its possibilities, and then moving beyond it. So, I mean, the design of the school was very much, I think, why that's individual and developmental. Um, but I think, people misinterpreted this femininity. I don't think it was superficial vanity. It was really spiritual work for her with matter itself that she said, even I had this one quote that I remember, cleanliness is the first indispensable step towards the supramental manifestation. For her, beauty and order and refinement, care of material forms, these things prepare matter, no matter what form it's in, to receive higher consciousness and force. So like the cosmetics and the silks, the attention to her physical presentation, I think they're pedagogical tools. And she was showing these matters. Well, she was showing that matter matters, that the body isn't an obstacle to overcome, but really it is the field, it is the site of transformation. And so the psychic being, if we get back to that teaching, it evolves through all of these forms, all genders across millions of lifetimes, and why I think, rebirth and a teaching about rebirth is so crucial here. That everybody's been male and female, third gender, in countless different bodies. And that the current gendered body that one is in is always provisional. And so it's just one chapter in one very long story. So I think Mirra could embrace her own elaborate femininity in that particular lifetime because she understood it as one expression among many that the psychic being will explore. And so the goal isn't just to be less feminine or more masculine or, perfectly balanced. The goal is to become the psychic being itself in a body, which has been all genders and will eventually manifest a body for her, all the while being limited to none. And so this vision of a new being, this androgynous new being, I don't think it's genderless in the sense of a bland or neutral, androgyny, but it's a gender transcendent while containing the fullness somehow of all gendered experience that the psychic being has gathered, across all the lifetimes it's explored. Um, but that's, of course, that's also,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, that's pretty philosophical.
that's right.
Um,
That's my book, right? That's my book.
yeah, and I mean, okay, from a biographical point of view, she dressed that way because she grew up in Paris in 1890, and that's the way people dressed. And why should she change the way she dressed just because other people? And I don't know that in the ashram too many people were upset about this. The women, once she took up the sari, people would she learned how to drape the sari, and people would give her beautiful saris. And when people knew that she liked perfume, that they found out which brand she liked and imported that from France. So. I think she in a more contingent way, she dressed that way and she presented herself that way because she just that felt comfortable and that's what she was. And I don't know that right. Okay. It's also true that she rejected the role of a woman, a childbearing woman, a child-rearing woman. There's that line in a play of hers, "Let's not be mammals." And when she had her son, like most women of in France at the time of her class, she sent the son out for to a wet nurse, and didn't really have much to do with him for the first 3 or 4 years of his life. So she rejected that role as other again. This was historically framed. Many people in France did that. Um, so she took on the what I mean we're all calling gender roles and things like that. That's just the way she was. And I don't know that there was necessarily um, a lot of philosophical intention in her doing that. Um, People either liked it or lumped it, and some particularly from outside the ashram who didn't really know and might have had more traditional Hindu notions of how a holy woman was supposed to act. They might have reacted. But I think within the ashram there wasn't much opposition. I think rather people were glad that she was dressing well, and they really went out of their way to offer her things that would conform to her or help her express this idea of beauty in the physical. I don't disagree with that your philosophical interpretation of it, but it I think as it took shape in her mind and in her life. It was just just like people who dressed in kurta and dhoti kept their kurta and dhoti when they came to the ashram.
But one doesn't, I mean, when I went there, I mean, you can really see the difference between this is the ashram space, and here's Pondicherry. I mean, the difference is palpable in terms of the care that the buildings receive and so forth. I mean, one sees,
That's for sure.
right? I mean, that I think
And
that's
I think
part
that
of it.
came from her. That's I mean that the buildings are so well maintained, and that there's a service for placing flowers, and that there's garden-like atmospheres in the ashram and in the school and other places. Yeah, that shows her touch for sure. And she was a very aesthetic person, and so she viewed the physical world in such terms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think matter matters for her. That's what that's what I'm saying. And I guess it's not so much, it's not arbitrary, and it wasn't just cultural. I mean, I think she was also, this is a spiritual practice that really wanted to transform matter. It wasn't just interested in um, leaving it as it is.
Mm.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just staying on gender for a little bit longer, it's making me think a lot of the kind of theosophical idea of the unsexed soul, and how that appealed so much to women in America, particularly. The articulations of spirituality in its early formation by Vivekananda, Madame Blavatsky, or even looking before the American female spiritualists who were able to take on a platform through this kind of this going beyond gender, this transcending gender dynamic. But yeah, one of the interesting dynamics again is how, as she starts to consolidate authority and be given more responsibility to guide over the kind of the young anarchic, very male energy within that early ashram formation. How did that change that? Could you both talk more about actually how that changed the dynamics? How that it maybe introduced new forms of grace, or devotion, or authority, hierarchy, and tensions around this, how that might have been problematic. The sudden withdrawing of Aurobindo imposed from without, potentially, in terms of how it's seen. And Peter, would you like to go first?
I um I don't see so much tension as development, as an evolving approach to things. Certainly when she showed up, um, this very bohemian bunch of guys sort of had to straighten up. I don't think there was a definite laying down of rules, right? Um, Make your beds and comb your hair, and so but just having women around um, who have a sort of sense of beauty and order uh, brought about that change. I helped to bring about that change, and then um, Sri Aurobindo was glad at that point to he was already withdrawing to some extent after the mother's. She spent several years kind of silently, but in the mid-20s she began to come forward, and he was glad to move back. And in 1926 that became a kind of fixed thing, right? That he didn't emerge anymore, and he told people that she was in charge both of their spiritual and practical lives. And yeah, so I don't know that there was tension. Certainly, people were unhappy when he drew back. But I think the great majority were quite happy already that she was coming forward, that she was taking an interest in their lives, that she was seeing them. Something that Sri Aurobindo himself really did is kind of work with people one to one, and so when he withdrew, the the um, the compensation was that she came forward So I don't know quite where is the tension that you find?
Well, so I'm asking. I'm not finding. I'm asking if you from your deeper study have found how the youngsters who are surrounding him, as he's this kind of older brother, the dada or the the comrade dada figure, whether his withdrawal is seen as a form of betrayal by some of his um, his younger
They would have been
friends.
happy if they could approach him. They would have been happy if they could have approached him. Um, and they no doubt regretted his going away and going back, drawing back, and his their being able to see him only 3 and then 4 times a year. Um, but again, the mother came forward. She gave pranams. She had these other um, forms of communal practice, this famous soup ceremony and that sort of thing. Um, you mentioned something about their sonhood to him as a father figure, but that never really um, became something tremendously important. He even joked about it. Whereas that she was the mother and that they were her children, that was something he definitely promoted and almost enforced. When they wrote to him all these letters that he answered, they were all addressed to the mother. And that was a pattern that he insisted on, that it's to her that you approach. And so yeah, well that he himself um, played an active role in making that switch, I think is significant. But in the end, sure, I mean the she became the mother of the children, if you will, the disciples. And that's just the way things worked out in the 30s, the 40s.
Are you saying he resisted though being placed as a kind of a father figure in that case? If he's creating a household of sorts, are you saying he
Well,
spoke about this?
I can't think of cases where he did certainly some of his disciples he treated very much as children, as sons, as um, so his children. Um, but only with a few actually did that kind of relationship develop. Whereas for everyone, without exception, the mother was the mother.
Yeah, which I think is there's a tension in this kind of hierarchy that's there that she enforces, he enforces at the beginning, and then I think in the later in her life she tries to dismantle. She finds this, she's uncomfortable, I think, at least, and sometimes being known as the mother, being known as the guru, being known as somebody on a pedestal. Where she, at the beginning of the very beginning of her living pattern with the, in the 1920s, with the early disciples, early sadhaks, that she showed as a devoted devotee how to treat Aurobindo as somebody on a pedestal. And she's down below, and there's a submissive kind of demonstration there that it became the guiding rule for everybody else at that time. And so this chum who everybody loved to hang out with is no longer, the intimacy is the cost there. I mean, they kind of lost that at the beginning. And I think what Peter's saying, yeah, they would have liked to have been hanging out with their buddy Aurobindo, even though he was somehow, um, different or something. Uh, but both of them enforcing this kind of hierarchy there at the beginning was a shakeup. And then later in her life, to dismantle it was another kind of shakeup that I see happening over time. That as the new
Well,
consciousness.
it just became too much for her. She couldn't
Yeah.
walk down the corridor without being just overwhelmed with uh, questions, comments,
Mhm.
prostrations, and
Mhm.
I guess she would have liked and she did, even when she, through sickness, had to withdraw for some time. Um, and complained that it was just too much. She always came back and she always opened herself, and she never totally cut herself off until the very, very end. So that's also something that just developed. But she was almost until the end. She was always open and always listening and always reaching out. But I mean, when you have 3,000 people, um, and all of them want to see you, it's kind of tough, right? So
Right.
she had to. You speak about dismantling. I think it just became an impossibility practically.
Right. Absolutely. Right.
Could I ask you both if you wouldn't mind trying to periodize that a little bit? I mean, so at what point did this shift occur, and were there any other similar shifts that kind of changed the way in which she was a spirit mother?
Through the 30s and 40s, she just um, gradually um, took on more and more responsibility and was reaching out to more and more people. If there was a big, big, big transition, it was 1951, because
Mm.
after Sri Aurobindo's passing and after the brief period of reflection, bang, she came forward absolutely. And so from that point, although she still spoke of herself as doing Sri Aurobindo's work, she was doing it on her own. And she was increasingly doing it in her own way. Not that she uh, ever relinquished the idea that she was just um, the helper, the Shakti of Sri Aurobindo. Um, she found herself alone, and so then who else were people to turn to? And so then this huge pileup of responsibilities happened, and it couldn't last forever.
Yeah, and I think that increases in the 60s and 70s, right? After what she called the 56 experience in February of the golden dawn or the golden day. Um, there's increasing kind of her just becoming more identifying not so much with mother, but this apprentice of the divine of tomorrow, she calls it. I mean, becoming more of a child kind of figure, like, or someone who's learning just as much as anybody else. I mean, it really kind of, she's really modeling anyway a new kind of guru, if that's what she thinks of herself as. I mean, it's still an authority, and there's still a relationship. Obviously, 3,000 people looking to her for leadership and guidance and so forth. But she herself is internally experiencing, anyway, in the mother's agenda, um, deeper darknesses, or you could say just, an identity that's just shifting a lot.
I don't quite follow what you mean there.
Well, she talked about herself as being an apprentice to the divine of tomorrow, more as something that, as an identity that she's not sure what's going to happen to her body, what's going to happen to humanity in general, what's going to happen to the earth, and so forth. And she becomes um, uh, sort of, I don't know, open to the mystery of that future, and is not hanging on to, I think, clear hierarchies the way that she established in the beginning that were maybe helpful for her and the community in the beginning. She herself, towards the end of her life, I see her sort of doesn't want more divisions, more kind of static roles for people. And yet people want them. Her students want them.
Mm.
I don't know. What do you think? That's my reading.
Yeah, I didn't I don't know when this role changing of roles took place as you see it. But I think she just in a certain sense went with the flow. She just, what was demanded of her, she would give as much as she could until she couldn't give any more.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm just talking about things she said, yeah, maybe in practical fact, when it didn't change, her behavior was the same. But
mm,
what she writes about in Mother's Agenda is her own kind of growing sense that, um, yeah, there's a kind of not very defined role, and I mean that her role is not as defined as it used to be, or that these roles of student and master are breaking down or shifting somehow.
mhm,
But yeah, you're right. Practically, that didn't mean much. I mean, she still went out there and she gave darshan and she still did all the things that she did. But
mhm.
So it's we've actually overshot. So I'm sorry to our audience, but we've overshot slightly. So I would suggest, since it's almost well past time for the Q&A, if our audience could start sharing their questions into the chat. I hope you can all see
Well,
the
you've
Q.
got one there at the Q&A already.
yeah,
Yeah, and
I'm happy to.
ideally, if you could try and keep it to maybe one or two sentences. Um,
Okay, well, I'm into the advent of it as a hamper. Guru tradition can be religious. Sri Aurobindo himself, this question about use of the word guru, actually, it's a pretty long question, but I'll just get what's at the end. Sri Aurobindo didn't like the term guru all that much, but he accepted it when people kind of forced it upon him. And when he took on the role of the guru, he pretty much did so in the traditional way that the relationship expresses itself, say, in the Hindu tradition. Um, so, and as far as Hinduism, he uh, didn't believe that the ashram was a Hindu institution and didn't wasn't working to preserve Hinduism per se. Again, the thing's pretty long. Um, can you see the questions, Patrick?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I guess this kind of gets to maybe what I was trying to say at the end, but not very well. That
Well, why don't you take up David's question then?
yeah, the David's question is how do you place the 1956 descent of the supermind and the work that the mother described after 1951 in relation to individual sadhana or to the general spiritual landscape today? In other words, what is the field of action for sadhaks today, taking into account the mother's spiritual legacy? Yeah, that's, I guess that's a question of what are people who follow them to do? I mean, how are they meant to practice the integral yoga? Is that how you read that?
Well, yeah, so I guess what David is asking is um, after 1956, which was a general descent into the Earth atmosphere, as they said, um, then how does that general descent affect the individual sadhana of people? Um, what is the field of action of sadhaks
I
today?
see. Yeah, I think,
Um,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, that's sort of a whole chapter in my book,
Mm.
at the chapter 7, really about, this is I call it a descendant spirituality, one in which the goal or the practice sort of is going to vary by the person, and that the work of the supermind coming down to earth that's been accomplished by these gurus, and that's not the work of their followers. We're meant to sort of survive the force of that and integrate it into our lives as one does. according to one's own intuition. That's where I land anyway.
I mean, one thing that the dissent didn't mean is that there was nothing for the individuals to do anymore because it just was going to be done by the supramental, and I think maybe some people thought that, and it's quite true that people kept on looking for a way that they could just sit back and relax, and the supramental or whatever force was going to take over and do everything for them, and in fact, uh, both after that event and up till today, there's still a lot for individuals to do. And as far as, I mean, an individual sadhak has to think about that more than maybe opening himself to a higher force. But it doesn't certainly end the responsibility of the individual to take care of themselves. So Julian has a question here. Other teachers who recognize one another as co-equal. That's a good question, and I can't answer that. I don't know of any, but maybe you in the traditions you know of, the Sufi traditions or something like that.
No, I don't see of any that are, I mean, the closest that I can think of is Sri Ramakrishna and his wife, Sharada Devi, are both, even during their lifetimes, were worshipped as divine and equally divine. And Ramakrishna said this of his wife, and of course she said of him. But I don't, but they're unique, I think, the mother and Aurobindo, because of they're so active. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Sharada Devi was very much a kind of a traditional I mean, a kind of divine mother figure who um, wasn't like actively doing the things like that Mirra was doing, I guess, in her ashram. So no, I don't know of any of equal comparison.
Neither do I. So we'll
I mean,
go.
could I just add on to that point?
Yeah.
Because I think it fits a whole kind of paradigm of colonial encounter, in which the Brahmos were really trying to, first under Rammohn Roy, Raja Rammohn Roy was trying to introduce this notion of kind of deistic egalitarianism amongst fellow Brahmos. And so you have a lineage with people like Keshab Sen or Debendranath Tagore, who were trying to work out these ideas, and again, the tensions of being the authoritative leader of the church versus, how do you stand in relation to the equalizing principle of, a spiritual democracy? So maybe Debendranath Tagore and Keshab were really at the hard edge of that. Keshab ultimately becomes a kind of pope figure and
Mm.
vastly transcends his community.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in the Brahmo Samaj, there was very little harmony between the various splinter groups that developed. So,
Mm-hmm.
Jansu is asking, do we have evidence that the Gnostic society Sri Aurobindo spoke of was behind the idea of Oroville? And if so, what were the main links? I think the mother has spoken of Oroville as being a possible sort of nursery for the Gnostic society, but I don't know that she had that in mind when she decided to plunk people down on this arid, barren plain outside of Pondicherry. But in viewed in longer term, yeah. I mean, I think you could probably find things that she's said where Oroville is meant to be a new society. She might not have used the term Gnostic society. And well, things have developed as they've developed. Um, you want to take over reading them, Alex, or
Yeah, I mean, Patrick, would you like to respond to that one?
I don't have any information about that, so I think Peter's the best. Yeah.
We have a
well,
question from
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
We have a question from Sasha, which is, I'm curious about the role of aesthetic sensibility, as you discussed, as a feature of the mother and supramental consciousness. Is an opening to aesthetics a practice that opens supramental potentials?
Mm-hmm.
I think both Sri Aurobindo and Mother would say yes,
Yeah, absolutely.
unquestionably.
Yeah. And certainly the very ways in which they practiced their yoga was through, aesthetic or through artistic forms and encouraging that whenever that was natural for a sadhak, right? And so in using the arts as a means for spiritual growth, I found to be really what drew me in the first place to both of them, being an artist myself. But yeah, and seeing in them the kind of the role of beauty and the role of harmony and so forth. I mean, that's a chapter I devote in my book to. And the mother's working with specific sadhaks to sort of express in painting and in music Sri Aurobindo's poem. The poem, of course, being so central to the integral yoga of Savitri. So there's a lot of work been done on that, of course, Savitri and the aesthetics of that. So such a huge topic.
And would you like to look at the last question?
Well, that's addressed to me from Jean, Lady Jean, as she's known. I mean, she's insisting on the unity, the oneness of the mother and Sri Aurobindo, and they both insisted on that. And I think most people who follow her are interested in the one realize the role of the other, and I see them as two in one. So I think she found these. There's been a lot of talk of tension. Everyone seemed to be interested in finding tension, but I think there was a harmony in
Yeah,
they accepted the other as being complementary, as they each accepted viewed themselves as being part of a whole, of a
that's right.
oneness, of a unity.
Yeah, I
You
completely
you
agree.
kind of, I mean, she was complaining that you came on a little strong like that, and I kind of uh, with destruction of stuff and that sort of thing. Um, but certainly there was change. I mean, there was and there was old patterns that were overturned. That's for sure. Um, but I don't think there was any uh, conflict between the two of them. I don't
No,
think so. Yeah.
no, and that's not my claim. If that's what Lady Jean is saying here, I would not want to argue that at all. Yeah, I don't see that at all. I think they worked together and they wanted to present a unified teaching as much as they could in practice and so forth, and they did. And yeah, in my scholarship, I'm only sort of pointing out potential, changes and developments and differences that I think are often covered up and I think we need those differences are interesting and part of the texture of this very rich, very important tradition.
So I think we're at the end of our session now.
Yeah.
So I want to say a huge, I mean, unless we've just had another question come in. So we could
What's
ask,
that?
would you like to take that? Could you explain how
Yeah.
integral education fits into integral yoga? Are they related or must they be seen separately? And can this be attributed to both Mother and Aurobindo equally? How intentional or organically did this concept of integral education develop?
They both wrote about education. Sri Aurobindo more in his political days, he wrote about national education, which was an issue at the time. When the mother came along, I think the issue of education arose because children appeared in the ashram, and she had to do something about them. She founded a school, first a very small school, but then as it went along, she developed her ideas about education, and this term integral education is how it's described. And I think it has a very important place within the integral yoga, both in Pondicherry itself, because there's a school here that's meant to follow, meant to put into practice integral education. And also there's plenty of schools in Orissa and Punjab and all sorts of places that are openings to the yoga if they're taken that way. And I don't think in any of these schools, including the ashram school, the students aren't said, okay, you're here to become yogis, and so we'll learn about yogic sort of stuff. They learn French and English and chemistry and history and things like that. But it certainly can provide an opening to the yoga. And how intentionally or organically did this develop? I think a combination of both. It organically because in the mother's case, she had these children suddenly that she had to uh, provide an education for because there was no schools. But then as organically this little school grew into a bigger school, she began to theorize, if you will, her ideas about education, and it's something that's survived and is still flourishing. This and you know, quite a long ways after the founding, 75 years and more. So yeah, there's been both intention and organic development.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add. I think that, yeah, I was happy to, I mean, one thing I could add is I wish I would have had Peter's book before I wrote mine. But although I utilized a lot of his research anyway, but to have, I think Peter's book now is quite a gift, and I'm grateful.
In yours, in its different approach, certainly is something that everyone can benefit from reading.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Alex for being a super moderator
I know, me
and
too.
with an incredible memory and presentation of his. You don't have one of those things that reads out the text teleprompter? No, but you no, very very fluid development, presentation, and kept things going. And thank you also, Patrick,
Thank you
for
very
everything you
much.
had to say. Yeah.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thank you to the audience for joining us and for your questions. And yeah, I hope you get a chance to read Patrick and Peter's books very soon.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.